video, I'm going to go over the tutorial for how to do some resawing on the Rikon 3061 Deluxe. I'm going to go through different blade options and how we're going to set up the table, set up the bandsaw to get the best performance, as well as different tips to improve your performance with resawing, as not everyone has a variety of tools. So there are different things that can improve the performance, but I will work through examining how to get the best from what you have. Now, the first thing that we're going to look at is blade choice. I'm going to walk through a 1/2 inch, the original 3/8 inch that came with Rikon's bandsaw, as well as a 1/4 inch. The 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch are both by Olsen. These are easily found on Amazon. Generally, one thing we want to look for in resawing is a lower tooth count. I believe 3 may be the lowest, but anywhere from 3 to 6 is probably ideal. When you're resawing, you're probably going to have to plane or sand to get a perfect surface afterwards. This saw isn't built for really extreme, resawing, so you're unlikely to get a perfect surface right off of there, but you can get really close. The first thing we're going to do as we prep this bandsaw for resawing is we're going to take the blade off. I'm going to put on a 1/2 inch to start, but I just wanted to go through how to remove the blade on this again. So underneath here there are 2 knobs which release this first. We're going to take this off. We're going to pop out the insert. We're going to grab the 3rd largest hex key from the back, and there's a bolt in here as well as a washer. Do not lose the little washer. This is what keeps this table relatively level with itself. We're going to then back all the bearings off. There's 3 on the top, 3 on the bottom. Just back them off. Make sure your saw is unplugged for this. I'm going to open these both up. And then I like to have this down a little further to create a straighter line here. If this is up here, this will catch sometimes on this coming out, especially on thicker blades like the 1/2 inch blade. And then I like to come to the left side here, push these all the way open. We're going to release the tension so that this wheel drops. It's a lever on the back. I'm just going to give about a 1/2 crank to the left to loosen it. And then I start on the side with the blade guard, pull it out of there first, and then come out the side. And just like that, the blade's out of there. And I'm now going to install this 1/2 inch blade on there. Like I said, we're going to walk through using a 1/4 inch, the 3/8 inch default blade, and then this 1/2 inch blade. This is quite old, but all I ever use it for is resawing, so there's probably enough life left in it to get through a few more resaws. You definitely don't need this, though. If you're doing harder woods, it's probably a good idea. This has a little kink in it, so it may be a little hard to get a perfect tensioning, but we're going to give it a go. You can see a kink right here. So to put this on, and these are a little harder because they're more rigid. We're going to go through the outside first. Again, this is in a straighter line. You can see how much more rigid this is. I'm going to go over the top, and then we're going to go under the bottom. One thing to watch out for is sometimes this little clip will hold up a blade, so make sure if you're having trouble getting it in there, just take a quick look here and make sure you're not stuck around this clip. And then we're going to tighten it. We don't have to worry about getting it perfectly centered right away. We'll tighten it just to get it on there, and we'll just give it a few spins just to get it riding on there. Now, looks like I'm quite far to the back, so what I'm going to do here to at least start is I'm going to unscrew this, which moves back this entire assembly. I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom. We're going to then come around, let's see if I can find a good angle here. We're going to come around and we're going to give this some spins. We're making sure we're on there pretty well. Spin it until you can see that it stops. And we're going to be looking at this side here. This is incredibly loose. There's almost no tension on this. So we're going to then click to the right as we hand spin it. And we're going to look for it to get relatively centered. The 1/2 inch on the Rikon, the 1/2 inch blade, is about the width of the tire itself. So it's a little hard to get centered. This is going to be the biggest blade you can put on this. But sometimes it's going to be hanging over a little bit if it naturally wants to ride there. After a few tightens, we're going to check this again. Okay, we're getting pretty close. About an 1/8 of an inch to a 1/4 inch deflection with just a modest amount of pressure. And we will then do a little more tensioning and tuning of the tracking, which is done with this knob back here once we turn the bandsaw on and get it spinning. So we're going to leave that where it is for now at a good starting spot. And again, I don't expect this blade to track super well because there is a kink in it, but it will be fine for resawing. Once it's in the wood, it generally gets stabilized a little bit by the kerf. And we're going to leave our bearings all pulled back, though I am going to tighten this whole assembly down. And we're going to then turn the power on, and we're going to see where we're at. One thing I mentioned in my other video is I like to keep a nickel around to test for vibration. When we turn it on, usually you're getting relatively close to a good tension when this nickel does not fall over at all. So we're going to turn this on, and it's probably going to flutter a fair bit. We're going to try to then turn it to the right until it stops fluttering, back it off till it's fluttering just a little, then a little bit to the right until we get it to just settle down. Now this is probably still going to flutter some, but we want to get it to where we're noticing a succession between a lot of flutter and either perfectly straight, which you ideally will get, or just a little flutter if your blade is a little kinked. One thing I would recommend is being prepared on this knob. It may move quickly one way or the other. We're going to come up here and we're going to look in here and we're going to watch this as we have our hand on this ready to correct if needed. We're also going to be coming back here for tracking. As you can see there, we've got quite a bit of noise and flutter, so we're likely a little too tight, but it's possible we're also too loose, but I'm going to guess a little too tight. So we're going to crank this to the left a little bit. And one thing I like to do is after I crank it to the left, I like to give it just a quarter turn or less even to the right to put that positive pressure on there. I don't like to leave it all the way turned to the left. I'm not sure if that totally matters, but an old guy I know once told me that, and it's always seemed to work, so I just go with it. I'm going to turn this on. We're going to crank this to the left a little bit. Now I'm pretty happy with where that is. You can see as the blade slowed down, it kind of kinked left and right like this because of the bend in it. But we notice the nickel's not moving at all. So I'm pretty happy with that. So we're going to start from there. We're going to now put all the bearings back. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at how these back bearings here line up on this blade. We want them to be lining up so that they're behind the teeth here. We're going to loosen this and we're going to push this forward till we see it line up over there, just slightly behind the front teeth. So we'll go a little further forward, and it looks like we're hitting it there, and we are pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. We're going to tighten this back up. We're then going to come to the front and we're going to push these in. These both are on springs. We're going to push these in just so we can see a little daylight, about a 1/16 of an inch. Now because this blade has some flutter or some bent in it, it will probably hit these initially, but that's okay. I'm not too worried about that. We'll do the same thing to the bottom, and then we'll come back up here. We're going to take this back bearing here, which is pressed from behind, and we're going to set this up. We're going to tap it forward just so it taps, and then we'll go back just a little bit. And you want to be able to press this so that it has a little travel, but it doesn't hurt your finger to press that in there. You should not be like hurting yourself when you press that. If you have to hurt yourself to press that, it's got way too much room in between it. I'm going to do that to the bottom, and we'll be set up there. We will then insert the insert again. We will attach this bolt back on there. Then we will put this back on here, and we're going to go into setting up whether this table is at 90 degrees and our fence is at 90 degrees. If you prefer, it may be easier for you to leave this off to do your table, but I don't really think it matters all that much. It's an aluminum fence, so it's quite light. Don't forget your little washer here goes on the inside there. We are now going to go through and make sure our blade is square to our table. The first thing we're going to do in the back here is we're going to loosen this. We're going to raise this all the way up to give us the majority of our blade showing so that we can put a square up to it. We're going to take our square now and we're going to put it up against here, and this should be pretty close. Yeah, I'm very happy with that. I've tuned this before. Got a little bit of room up top here, but not a huge deal. On my table, these don't sit all the way perfectly parallel. I don't know if it's just manufacturing, so I know that if I square to this side, it's always going to be a little off on here. But since I set my fence on this side, I always want this one to be where it's truly square to the blade. And that may be the same for you as well. Yeah, we're perfectly good there. If yours, however, is not square, we are going to go to the back here. We're going to talk about how to adjust this table. If your table is not square, we've got two key things here. This knob right here loosens the entire mechanism to hold this. And then under here we have a nut and a bolt. Now there's an included wrench here. And what you will first do is you will loosen this table. You will tilt it up so you can get easier access to this. You will then loosen the nut on the bottom here, and then you will be able to finger twist that bolt up or down. And each time you give it a twist, you will come back, you will press it down, hold it there, lock that in, and just tinker with that a little bit up and down, and you'll eventually get it to 90. And this is what ensures that it stays at 90 and doesn't push down. This takes a little time. Once you do it once, it's not too bad. It sometimes helps if you get it to 90 to put a little weight on this while you tighten this so that it doesn't move at all. I like to use this bolt here as kind of the holding point while I'm tightening this, because as you tighten this, you may notice a little wobble in it, which can make it a bit harder. Once you've got this to what you believe is 90 degrees, go back up top and double check with your blade. Like I said, you can use an angle gauge on the blade itself, but you have to put it on there and then wait quite a while for the blade to stop kind of moving. So if you don't have a trusted square and you have one of those, that's probably going to help you more than a cheap square. Once you believe you've got your table to 90, you can come back, double check it with a square. Now remember, there's a little under 5 inches here, so you're going to need a square that's under that. This is a Groz, G-R-O-Z, machinist square from Amazon. I really like it. They're a pretty reputable company, and this is a 4-incher, which allows me to fit under here, and it's good for table saw blades as well. The key with machinist squares is that they are permanently affixed at 90 degrees, unlike a combination square, so you can assure that it will always be at 90 degrees. Combination squares, sometimes they can wiggle, you can get some dust in there, so these are really good for setting up machines. Now, since we've got this 1/2-inch blade on here, I want to make a note of this is a very aggressive blade. It's got 4 teeth per inch, meaning 4 teeth per every inch. This is what they call a hook tooth. Now, that's a quite aggressive cut. That's fine. When we're resawing, we're not expecting on this level of bandsaw to get a finished surface off of there. If you spend thousands of dollars, maybe you'll get pretty close to a finished surface, but you're going to have to plane or sand this afterwards. The more aggressive and the less teeth allows you to go through harder woods faster. The larger the gullet, much like a table saw blade, allows more dust to be pulled down with it, meaning less heat buildup, meaning a quicker cut. So while I will show you with a 1/4 inch and a 3/8 that are higher tooth count, if you are going to be doing a ton of resawing or on a lot of hardwood, I suggest going ahead and getting something with a 4 tooth count. It doesn't have to be a 1/2 inch. A 3-inch blade with a 3, 4, at most 6 will be okay too for this size bandsaw. We're now going to talk about how we adjust this fence. It's got a little bit of adjustability, not a ton, but we can do definitely getting it to square at 90 degrees up and down. This is not adjustable really. It kind of self-pulls itself in. So if it's off at all, there's not really a whole lot you can do with this. Now, this fence on it has a couple adjustabilities. It's got these 4 white, I guess, nylon hex screw inserts, which will push the fence up and down on either side. So the best way to do this is to set it on there, clamp it down. Now in a previous video I mentioned sometimes this comes extremely tight and you have to sand down these in front here just a little bit at a time. You have to sand these down just a fraction, because these while allowing for some going in and out. They don't really, due to the way this is set up, allow for a whole lot of adjustment left or right. I'm not sure they're designed, but the way this sits, to get it tight, you can't have any real looseness in the front. It's not the greatest design in the world, but mine came relatively square this way. If for some reason you are off by a bit left or right, you could attempt to shim this by loosening this up on the bottom here, pulling this out, and then sticking ever increasing size shims between one end or the other. Now there's going to be kind of a limit on how far out you can go, as this does want to pull itself in. But if you're off by just a little bit, shimming may be your best bet to try to correct any left and right drift here. As I said, these don't really allow for a ton of movement left and right, a tiny bit, but when you pull it down, these aren't necessarily what's clamping it to the back there. It's more this and the front part. So if you start doing these a bunch, it will get extremely tight and you will not be able to freely move it on there. It's a very odd design, like I said, and I don't know why they did it that way. So the main thing we're going to look here is at adjusting this to 90 this way, so that when our board runs through, we're not getting a cut that's coming through at an odd angle there. We want it as close to even by the time we get to the end as well. Now to begin our adjustment of this fence, we're just going to lock it down somewhere and we're going to put our square up to it. Now make note here, if these tables are not perfectly even for you, give yourself enough room on this left side, since we're going to be resawing against the fence on this side, so that this sits totally flat. Mine goes, this one's a little lower, so it's not a huge deal. You can see just a little wobble there. But we're going to see where we're at here. And I've definitely got too much daylight up top. That's pretty bad. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to unloosen all four of these until they're not making any contact at all. And we'll see where we're at after we unloosen all of them. Okay, I've unloosened all of these, and that actually took us almost to 90. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten each of these very slowly just until they make contact, and then I'm going to leave it at that. And we'll do a cut and we'll see where we're at. Now this is the second smallest provided hex key. Unfortunately, these are extremely annoying to adjust because you have to pull it out each time. But just very lightly go until it makes contact. We don't want to raise this, and we'll leave it at that. We'll do that for all four of them. Now, if you do need to tilt this fence, let's say you get it down all the way and it's flat and it's not right, there are two ways to do this. These screws on the right, as you go in, will lift, and as you undo these, that will loosen, allowing it to pull down. Now, you don't want to crank all the way up on this and not move these down at all. The less you can go down, the better. So adjust them up and down so that you are tilted as much as you need, but ideally you're not yanking this up and having these all the way pushed down. Conversely, if you need to go this way, screwing these down more will push this up, and pulling these out more will also help push it up that way. So if you are off a little bit, those are your two methods there. Just make sure that after you're done and you've got it at 90, you very gently screw any of them that are not touching so that they are just touching, so that when you lock this in, all four of these are touching this, but not so far that they are undoing your adjustments. At the very end, after you believe you've got this to 90, what I suggest is undoing it, moving a little bit, checking again. Just make sure there's no buildup anywhere here where you've got any chips on this. And as long as you can get a few places and it looks at 90, you should be good to go. So we're going to go through and do our first resaw now. We're going to do our first one on hard maple through this from a neighbor's tree that I milled up this summer. And we're going to see how that goes. I just want to do a quick look at what we're going to resaw today. I've got 3 pieces of walnut that are about 1.25 inches thick that I eventually need to get down to about 3/4, maybe 7/8, and then plane from there. Now, on these 3, I have jointed them using a planer sled. However, I know a lot of people don't have a planer or a jointer, so I left this one unjointed. And it's got a nice little twist in it, a nice little cup. So you'll get to see the results if you don't have anything jointed and flattened at all. And I also want to mention that I occasionally use this blade lubricant from Olsen. I can't say that I've noticed a massive difference on dry wood. However, I've noticed an incredible difference if you're milling up wet logs. These all came from wet trees in the summer that I did, and when I was cutting them down to size after the initial chainsawing, it's unbelievable how much of a difference that made. The one downside is that once it gets hot, it obviously starts to remelt a little bit again, and it can eventually build up on your blade or on your bearings. So just take that into consideration if you decide to use it or not, that you may have to scrape it off or clean it off. Another thing that I use is a push stick for finishing the cut. Now, I just want to mention too, the push stick style I use. When you get a resaw going, you have this awkward moment at the end where you need to push this all the way through if you need every inch of this. And you have to either get your fingers very close, you have to try to pull from the other side, or I've seen some people even walk around and pull from the other side, or you need to use a push stick with a little heel on it and push it through. Now I like this method and keep my hand away from the blade. I've also just taken a piece of 2x4 and cut this shape out of it and then held it going this way. So really there's a bunch of methods. You could just use a push stick and push this through. But one thing I will note is that we obviously have a limited table length here. And the longer the piece you get, you're probably going to need some kind of outfeed. Now I've never bothered to do that. And when I'm usually resawing, I leave an extra few inches here on the end that I won't need, because quite oftentimes as this gets way off of here, you get a little bit of unsupported nature to it and you don't get a perfectly even cut. So if you don't have any outfeed, and especially if you are new to resawing on this, I highly suggest you do not have this cut to final length ahead of time, because there's a good chance this very end here will not be as even as the rest of this. One other thing I want to mention is that while it's not absolutely necessary, it really helps to have this a straight edge on this that's definitely 90 degrees, because when we are putting it on the bandsaw, obviously our fence is referenced off of the table, so we want this to be at the same reference as this. If this is slanted at all, you either have to cant your fence away to make up for that, or else you're going to have a cut through here that is the opposite of whatever angle you're going through. So if possible, do your best to get a good straight edge on that. Even if you don't have a planer, a jointing jig, there are many videos online on jointing jigs, which is what I use. I don't have a jointer. And it gets a really nice, clean, straight edge on there. I can't emphasize enough how important that is to getting an even cut. It's very easy to get an accidental angle going one way or the other. So we're going to be preparing to resaw this hard maple, this 1/2-inch blade. This is not jointed, though it does have a straight edge on it that got it pretty close to 90. Because it's not jointed, there's a little twist in this, so it's quite likely at the end the very edges of our board may be a little thinner or thicker than the middle part. Now I'm going to use my vacuum while I'm doing this, because this kicks up a ton of dust. Now our final preparation for the resaw here is going to be aligning this to our distance. Now if you have setup blocks, that's great, those are perfect for there. But oftentimes you don't, and what I would suggest is marking out on the top here where you want the cut, marking which side is in, and I would set it there. But again, I would leave yourself, if possible, a 1/16, an 1/8 extra to plane down at the end, because it's very likely that this is not going to be a perfect cut, because this is only a 1/2 horsepower, so it does a little bit of harder work to get through there. What you want to line up with, you'll notice on this that the teeth come out to the side of it, so you want to try to line up with the middle of the blade itself and not with either of the teeth. One thing I left out of my review, and I'm kicking myself for this, is that this slot, this miter slot here, is a very odd size. It's 5/8 by 1/4, or a little under 1/4, and most common featherboard systems don't fit this. So you either have to make your own or get mag switch or magnetic ones, because this is cast iron, and do it that way. But common featherboards are not in 5/8 inches, and maybe there are some out there that I've just never found, but that is one of the downsides of this that I wish I had remembered to put in my review. I just never use it. I suggest dust masks, eye protection, and then I suggest rolling your sleeves up too, because as you come towards the cut here at the end, You don't want any long sleeves hanging in here as you go by, especially if you're going by with a push stick. So always roll your sleeves up if you're wearing long sleeves. Okay, well, we made it all through. That's the good news. The bad news is I realized that my body was in the way of this entire segment, so I'll have to reset that for the next board. So unfortunately you didn't get to see all of this, but I'm pretty happy with this. You can see what I mean by leaving a rough surface. Now a lot of the rougher marks are from what I guess I would consider user error. So as we're pushing through, you know, you're keeping pressure on this way, you're trying to keep it up against the fence, but every once in a while you have to kind of adjust your hands, and every time you let it move at all, you are keeping it, you're no longer able to keep it perfectly up against the fence, so it's very likely you'll get a few, I can see a few in here, little deeper areas from when I was clearly moving my hand forward. So this is why we leave a larger amount on the cut we want. Now on book match, obviously you want to keep it as close as possible. And I personally do not use the 1/2 inch on the book match, because what I've noticed is that even though this is better for harder woods and going faster, it leaves a larger mark, a larger indent every time you have a little user error and move your hands. So I'd rather take it slower and, you know, only go through slightly softer woods than have to plane off a bunch of this and lose a really nice book match. Another problem people sometimes get when they're resawing is that all of a sudden it feels like it's really hard to go through. Well, a lot of time what will happen is that you're releasing all the internal tension in this wood, and it will pinch back on itself after you get beyond the blade. Now, of course, you can't see that because you're going through here. So if you feel that, turn the saw off, and you're going to need to get a wedge. With your wedge and the saw off, you're going to need to stick it in there just a little bit so that this is the opening of the kerf again, and then you should be able to go through with that wedge there. That's one of the biggest problems with bad resaws, is that they start to close in again. You can't see it, suddenly you're slowing down. One of the keys to a good resaw is consistent speed. The more consistent you are, the more consistent your cut will be, which is why it's such a big issue every time you have to adjust your hands, because you're slowing for a minute and you're putting a little pressure. You can see every time I move my hands, there's a little bit of movement there. Feather boards are great for this, right? So you don't have that issue, but we have this problem with this miter slot here. So overall, I'm pretty happy for that being hard maple and this being an old blade with a kink in it. So we'll do some walnut ones now with 3/8 inch standard blade and then a 1/4 inch blade as well. I also want to point out really quick that if you remember, this is the board that was not jointed at all, and it had a nice twist in it. And we could see exactly how this played out by using our calipers and noticing the difference in thickness as we go along. Because with a twist in it, or a bow especially, it's going to be riding the fence and then coming like that if you have a concave side that's into the fence. So it's going to be very hard to keep it straight through there. It's going to slowly go away. As you push in here, as you go further, this will go out because you're now pushing the bowed area onto that. And we can see that in this piece, which, especially after releasing tension, holy moly, did that thing go pretty wild. On one end, on the end we started on, we've got 0.6901 and we've got 0.6725 on this end. So, you know, 0.02, but it's enough that you're going to have to then plane off more from this end than this end. So this is why I say to leave a 1/16 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch extra, especially on wood that you haven't jointed or if you're new, because there's a real good chance that this may be a little thicker than this due to that bow or that twist causing the blade to not be perfectly straight through there. Alright, I've reoriented the bandsaw on the camera so that I shouldn't get in the way this time. I need to get all these pieces of walnut down to about 7/8 of an inch in the end. So I'm going to go down to a little under an inch, and I'm going to take off at this weird side. Now on this odd shape here, I just want to point out that we always need to have our bearings just above the highest point. We want this blade to stay as stable as possible. The more we give it above our wood, the the more it can flex. So you want your bearings just slightly above the tallest point. And you really want to check this beforehand, because if you're going through and you get caught on that, well, it's going to have some big, repercussions. All right, so this walnut is going to be done on what I believe is the original blade. This is a 3/8 of an inch, I believe 6 teeth per inch. And the main difference, though, is that the stock blades and some of the cheaper blades on Amazon, like AO, AYAO, and some of the other ones, are thinner. They're not as thick. These are, I don't know, 0.018 or give or take. Olsen blades, more expensive ones, are usually 0.025, and that really helps with stability. So if you are buying a blade, if you've worn this one out, I suggest getting a thicker one like an Olsen. These obviously have a little extra flex in them, so we'll see how this goes. I'm definitely leaving myself some extra room here, and I'm just taking off this side. Now remember, this one has been jointed on a planer sled, so it's pretty flat, and then a straight edge has been put on here. And hopefully this will give you a better angle. Now, one thing to note is that we've got some cracks in here, so we'll see what happens with whether this pinches or not as we go through, and we may have to put a wedge in there. This closed up almost entirely. You can see at the end here how this is much thinner than the kerf here, and what this has caused to happen is you can see the blade on this is now touching this right bearing because it's being pinched. So this is where we'll go, and I didn't catch it probably until a little late, and we're going to put a wedge in this to keep that open. Now I bet we're going to have a little bit of a poor cut quality in this area here after it pinched together, so we'll see. Fortunately, we're still up against the fence here at 90, and you will have a little bit of a cut quality problem when you restart this again. I would back it off just a little bit when you restart it. Don't leave it exactly where it was, but I can feel the pinch in this. So we may even need a second wedge at some point as we get through. Okay, this is really cool. So I continued to cut, and you can see we've got into further down there, and this has now started to pull out. So we began with it pinching in down here, and now we are pulling out. You can just see the amount of internal stress in some wood, which is just, it's crazy. Obviously this isn't a great piece in terms of stability. You can see the grain here, we're going all over the place, but I don't see this happen a ton, but this is really pretty cool actually to get on film of a pinch and then an expansion here. Though unbelievably, we're actually pretty good thickness here if this was supposed to be a veneer or something, but you can see that pinch and then pull out. Very cool, very cool. Okay, so we got through this. I was not sure that blade was gonna make it. That blade is not meant for resawing, and you can see how rough it is in here. Obviously the pinching and then the expansion out didn't help. But you can see why people don't generally use the stock blades for the resaw. Definitely not the straightest cut in the world either. But I can live with that because I'm planing this down anyway. So if you're planning to do any resawing, get rid of this stock blade. You know, I'm sure this is fine for cutting shapes out with, I don't know, 1/2 inch wood, 1/4 inch wood. Plywood, but I would definitely not use that for resawing any kind of hardwood. Still, very cool to see both a pinch and an opening in the same one, but you can see kind of reminiscent of sometimes how you get it off of a sawmill, that same mark, which is not really what I want from my bandsaw resawing. This is pretty cool too. I just wanted to show you. We can see with how much that blade was bending because it's so much thinner, we get this cupping kind of shape out of it. That's not the wood, that is the blade being bent around it. This is why I highly suggest you don't use the stock blade for resawing. You can see how it's still nice and flat on this side that was jointed, but wow. All right, we're gonna do our final resaw here. Just another piece of walnut. I just want to get rid of the section that has this area going through without just running it through my planer a bunch. This is an interesting log and may cause some problems. You can see the pith went right through here. So we're going to try to take that off, but boy, we'll see. We'll see if it pinches or curves or not. I'm thinking that enough of this is missing that some of the pressure won't be there, but we'll find out. We may also see at some point the blade coming through here because I'm not taking a ton off. So that'll be interesting too. This is definitely a safety glasses one because I can imagine this flying out. Now this 1/4 inch Olsen blade is a 6 TPI. This one's the newest of all my blades, but not that new. And this board is 4 and 7/8. We'll just call it 4 and 7/8. So this is getting pretty close to maxing out what we can do here to give a real idea of the kind of height. Let's see if we can, yeah, we can get it under there. So we'll see how this goes. A lot of times I do end up using my 1/4 inch blade because I'm lazy and this is what I leave on there. But if you're going to be doing any more than one board, and honestly, I generally wouldn't do it with this much height probably, maybe 4 inches max, but we're just going to see how it goes. We've got an interesting knot in the middle here. It's always harder to get through the dense grain, so we'll see if that gives it any trouble. Yeah, let's do this. All right, that was awesome. That was a perfect resaw. I'd be stunned if these weren't nearly identical at either end. Obviously, it's got an easier time going through here, but you can tell sharper blade, even a 1/4 inch, just how much better it gets through there. So I highly suggest if you plan on doing resaw, even just every once in a while, buy a second blade and just don't use it for anything else. A good middle ground if you don't want to do the 1/2 inch is a 3 inch, no more than 6 teeth. I suggest the Olsen, a blade that's at least 0.025 thick, and just keep it around for resawing. You can see, I mean, there's barely any marks on here. A quick pass through the planer is going to clean this up so well. Sanding would clean this up. Again, obviously it wasn't going other than a few spots through the full 5 inches without hitting some of the softer spot. But this is generally my experience with a sharper 1/4 inch blade, is that walnut, cherry, soft maple, pine, obviously poplar, does pretty well. Once you start getting into hard maple, hickory, stuff like that, the exotics, I'd be going to a 3/8 if not a 1/2 inch and a sharp blade for those, or else you're going to have some problems. The lengthwise on this, by the time you're pushing through, you got to be holding on to this. So if you're going to be doing full boards, and you could absolutely do a 6-foot board on this, you just need some way to balance it out on the end. But in terms of the power and the ability of the saw, I really think you could do a very long board without any problems. Dust collection helps. I'm just going to say this, having the dust collector on, for whatever reason, helps. I'm guessing it gets the dust out of the gullets better. But there's a noticeable difference between having the vacuum hooked up and not having the vacuum hooked up when you're resawing. And you can still see how much dust was left over here coming out of that cut. But, imagine how much would be there without the vacuum on. All right, just to finish here, I just want to go over a few things and possibly a few troubleshooting issues. Obviously, this needs to be square, so remember to use these 4 hex screws to get it at 90 degrees. That's going to make almost the biggest difference of anything other than having a sharp blade. A sharp blade really helps. If you are noticing that when you line this up, it's off to the left or right, just this itself, you can try shimming this by loosening it up, pulling out one side, and sticking maybe a piece of paper in there to shim it out a little bit. That should help. A couple other problems that are relatively common with bandsaws are what's called bandsaw drift. That's when this blade naturally wants to kind of twist through here, and so as you're going through, it's going at a slight angle. Now, this can be solved a couple ways. One would be to shim this whole fence. Two would be to ditch this and either freehand it. If you have a planer and a jointer, you know, you can freehand. That's not a big deal. You'll be able to clean it up. Some people do just come through here, they draw a line and they just freehand it, because if you're getting the drift, by the time you're going through, you may end up going at an angle like this, but the blade will still be cutting pretty much down the center. So you may have to do that if you're having problems here. Though I would suggest that your issue is probably with tensioning, your bearings pushing this, or not being close enough, or your blade being dull. If you have it tensioned and tracking correctly, you really shouldn't be having that kind of issue. You can also make an auxiliary fence. Take some pieces of MDF, take a board, cheap piece of pine, and just start running it through a few times and figure out the angle of your drift, and then clamp the piece down so that you are pushing against the fence, but it's going at the correct angle to correct for your drift. Those are going to be your easiest ways to deal with any drift. If you are having trouble holding this at 90 degrees here, make sure this on your table saw is square, or if you need to, go get a magnetic feather board. That's probably your best bet. You could try to clamp something up against here, maybe a wooden one, but again, with the height, you're going to want something relatively tall. I know MagSwitch makes magnets for that, but they're quite expensive, which is why I've never invested in any. And then one thing also to notice is, you probably heard, this can create like a squeal fairly loud. That's not really an issue. Bandsaws just get very loud when you're resawing. So if you hear what seem to be somewhat alarming noises, it's probably fine. If you're hearing some kind of crazy rattling somewhere in here, you've got a whole bigger issue. But that squealing sound is not necessarily a sign you're doing something wrong. Just make sure to watch for any pinching as you go through. Just check around a couple times, put a wedge in it if you need to, and feel free to ask me any questions if you have any. Thanks.